Failing to plan ahead for your required minimum distributions could mean they push you into a higher tax bracket, could cause you to pay a surcharge on your Medicare Part B and Part D, known as IRMAA, and can have other costly tax consequences. When should you begin planning for your required minimum distribution? I've got that and more coming up. Over the past few years, they've been pushing out the age at which you are required to begin drawing at least a minimum amount out of your pre-tax retirement accounts, your traditional IRA, your pre-tax 401k. It used to be age 70 and a half that you were required to draw out a minimum amount from these accounts. RMD, required minimum distribution, used to be age 70 and a half for no one knows what reason. Why 70 and a half? No one knows. They then moved it to 72. That was Secure Act 1.0, and then Secure Act 2.0 moved it to age 73, which is where it is right now, and put a clause in there that it's going to be age 75 out there in a few years. But this delay at which this starts, does that mean you can afford to delay planning ahead for your required minimum distribution? Recently, I was pulled into a case analysis with a client who's done a great job saving up and has a few different sort of they've got a lot of tax diversification, let me say that. So they're in a position where they really don't need to draw anything from their retirement account, from their IRA. And they've got plenty of other income sources, Social Security, they've got a pension, and they've got a few dollars that they've inherited, about $1 million, and that they're living off of that. So they don't plan to draw anything from this IRA for a long time, but they've already retired, and they're just a couple of years away from this required minimum distribution starting. And when it starts, it's going to push them into a higher tax bracket significantly. It's going to push them into IRMAA, actually into the the third tier of IRMAA. They're going to jump 2 tiers, and their options are really limited as to what to do to help prevent this and avoid this. They got a late start. They weren't planning ahead for this required minimum distributions, and therefore their options now to limit it are limited. So when should you start planning for your required minimum distribution? I would say it's never too early to start planning for it, but that's a clickbait answer. That's not the real answer. Instead, I would say, no, you need to be aware. You do need to be aware of the required minimum distribution rules, even when you're getting started early in your career. If you knew that, well, at some point, yes, maybe you've done the analysis and you've worked with your CFP and said, yep, it's best for you at the beginning of your career to contribute pre-tax instead of Roth. I would really strongly argue with that approach, but working with your CFP, you say that's the route you go. I would want you to know up front that at some point, you're not avoiding the tax with that pre-tax contribution to your 401k, you're delaying the tax. At some point, you've got to pay the piper. You're going to be forced to draw those dollars out, and by a certain age, 75, here in a few years, you're at least going to be forced to withdraw a minimum amount. If you draw out more than that, that's fine, and that could have tax consequences. I want you to be aware throughout your entire career. That doesn't mean planning for it. I want you to be aware that your traditional, your pre-tax IRA, your pre-tax 401k will have this required minimum distribution attached to it. Your Roth IRA, Roth 401k will not. Your HSA will not. I want you to have that awareness. But when should you start actually planning? When should you start actually planning for this required minimum distribution? Well, it depends on your situation, but I would say at least 5 years before you retire. Why 5 years before you retire? Well, there's a few reasons. At this point, within 5 years of retirement, that retirement plan is really getting into focus. What age you want to be done, how much you think you're going to spend, that is all coming into focus. And why I say that, 5 years before you retire is because earlier in your career, yes, I want you to build out that 5-factor retirement plan, but those are assumptions that life is likely going to alter and adjust and will influence your plan as you get closer and closer to that age. But 5 years out from retirement, sure, those answers could still change, but they're much closer to what reality is going to be. Here's an example. Early on, this is a few decades ago, one of the individuals that we were serving, we were building out their retirement plan early in their career. And at that time, and this was, again, a couple decades ago, but they said, yeah, I think we'd be content spending about 30 grand a year. That's what we're spending right now at that time. And sure, this was a couple decades ago, so you might say 30 grand, that's not going to go very far right now, adjusted for inflation and so on. And we built out a plan and it worked great. They're still working right now, by the way. They make over 30 grand a month right now. So life has changed significantly. And so your retirement plan and those 5 factors will change for you significantly as well. So planning for your required minimum distribution beginning 5 years before you retire, a lot of those assumptions have been focused in on, and it's much clearer, and therefore you've got that perspective as to a more relevant perspective as to, well, what's retirement going to look like? What will the impact of my required minimum distributions be out there in retirement, and how can that influence my planning right now? As that retirement plan comes into focus 5 years out from retirement, so does your income plan as well. Again, it's going to be clear how much you think you're going to be spending in retirement. You might start making some assumptions as to when you're going to draw your Social Security and so on. And all of that is going to shape your income plan, and that's going to shape your tax picture as well. This is all connected, right? So that's going to start influencing, well, is it likely that you're going to start drawing out of your pre-tax accounts right away when you retire, and drawing at a level where it's going to be above that required minimum distribution? Therefore, really no need to plan for it. It's just going to take care of itself. Or is that income plan coming from that 5-factor retirement plan, is that income plan going to reveal, listen, you've got income sources coming from other places than that traditional IRA, and therefore your tax picture is going to look one way up until you draw your required minimum distribution, and then after RMD, your taxes are going to look very different. Since you're seeing that, still with a few years left in your career, you've got time. You've got choices. You've got earned income still where you can take a look, and with that reality, with that realization of here's what the plan's going to look like, you can then influence and make adjustments to your funding strategy over those last few years of retirement. Likely at this stage, these last few years of retirement, it's unlikely that you're going to be doing a lot of Roth conversions at this stage because your income's likely at the highest level it's been in your career. But maybe you are a 2-income household and one of you will retire sooner than the other, and therefore that's going to open the door for some Roth conversions. But likely at this stage, you're going to still with some income be able to say, oh, that's the impact of required minimum distribution. It is going to make a big influence our tax picture out there in the future. Let's adjust what we're funding right now. We're going to start funding Roth IRAs or Roth 401ks and that sort of thing. And then it's also going to tee up strategies for doing Roth conversions early in retirement, maybe even delaying Social Security. All of that with the visibility of your retirement picture coming into focus about 5 years before retirement. That will influence your income plan, and that will open up the planning possibilities, especially when there's still a few more years of earnings before you retire. So when it comes to planning for your required minimum distributions, again, not planning can cost you thousands of dollars. You want to have awareness about your required minimum distribution and the need for tax diversification throughout your entire career, but certainly begin planning for your required minimum distribution, working with your CFP at least 5 years before retirement so that you have the ability and still time to plan ahead and lessen the impact of your required minimum distributions. Work with your certified financial planner on that. If you don't have a CFP on your team, you can contact one on my team. Find us online, Korhorn.com. That's Korhorn with KWiseMoneyShow.com. You can find us there as well, or give us a call, 574-247-5898. All right, there you have it. Go out and take your next wise step in your financial life.